G'day guys. I watched a video today, one of Bart's. It was called LMHR Feldman Study Critique. So it's the one on the hyper-responders in terms of cholesterol and stuff like that. I've already covered some of that background information in one of my chats with Pim Johnson, and that was the one that on ApoE, and that sort of covers some of those important points. The reason why the ApoE4 or sort of 4.2, 4.3 and all that, the reason why that ancestral form existed originally, and how it was displaced by 3.3s and 2.2s over time, and why that happened in certain interglacial periods where the availability of certain types of carbohydrates and all that increased. And people did, like all animals in nature, when there's things that are available, you will actually partake in that sort of stuff. And even though these things were pre-hybridization or pre-anything like that, it was basically, like little berries and stuff like that. These were interglacial periods when some of this stuff was more available. More human or humans, Homo sapiens, this is 200,000 years ago. Homo sapiens have been around for about 350,000 years. That's when the first allele changes happened to ApoE33. And then we moved about 80,000 years ago to its approximately, these are pre-agricultural periods. Again, another interglacial period that basically brought about the ApoE22. In that period, it was even hotter than the previous one. So there would have been even more, leaner animals and more sugar in the environment. And so obviously that, but in comparison to today's terms, we're talking about very small amounts. We're talking about, in the vicinity of, 50 grams, 60 grams, those sort of things. That is what the ApoE phenotypes, that means chylomicron remnants basically being slowed down before they get into the system. People need to understand that basically this whole notion of, that apparently high cholesterol and all that is a problem, is just nonsense. It's bunkers. The reality is these adjustments happen in terms of the ApoE, which is like a little key that's handed over to the remnant chylomicron by the HDL to basically enter the liver through those receptors on the liver surface. Now, this is an ancestral thing. People that have consumed very little sugar and pretty much next to no sugar, these people, humans, if you take a look at even chimps, are eating either starvation food for them is leaves. They do not eat, they don't go out eating tubers because tubers are poisonous. They don't have fire. They haven't mastered the art of fire, so you can't actually deactivate those anti-nutrients. They will get very sick if they consume tubers. So that's a no-go, and many other things. Beyond a bit of seasonal fruit, there's nothing else. And they don't really touch that. There are a few monkeys that do, but primarily these are considered extreme starvation. They'll go to leaves before they ever go to fruit. I mean, it's just basically something that, there's a lot of fruit in the environment and they don't eat fruit. I've actually done a video with Bart showing quite clearly that their focus is on tearing to bits other little apes and eating them, or basically the females with their children go and actually get termites, go into termite mounds and try and get their sources of protein from there. And as starvation foods, then they go for leaves. but that's, very rare, and it's the focus. And that's what these in the wild, what they focused, and pretty much our connection, our genetic sort of evolutionary connection is there in the science being established quite clearly, and right through there is our adaptations to animal foods. And so having an ApoE of 4,4 is fine under those circumstances. But even the small introduction of interglacial, highly fibrous, very small fruit and stuff like that, which only increases, the intake potentially seasonal of anywhere between, you've 40 to 60 or 70 grams of carbohydrate. That's what brought about those other alleles. It was basically to slow down the take up of fat into the liver in order for the liver to deal with the extra sugar. And we're talking about when we're talking about extra sugar in terms of ancestral levels, we're talking about very low levels, 50 to 70 levels. So people who have got the ApoE 4,4, which is very similar, or 4,3, which is what Dave has, tend to be people that take up chylomicron remnant very rapidly. So when you've got a lot of sugar in the system at the same time, these people are more susceptible to insulin resistance, more susceptible to basically loading up the liver with both too much sugar and too much fat at the same time. That makes them more susceptible to insulin resistance, to Randle cycle activation, and to a whole lot of other things. It also makes them more susceptible because they're getting this higher energy flux through the liver, makes them more susceptible to more inflammation in the system. And that extra inflammation does make them more susceptible to things like Alzheimer's and many other things. But the ApoE 4,4 also makes them more, gives them more resilience to pathogens in the environment. So there's an advantage of having those. So that shift in the food supply took away a bit of that advantage to modern humans' detriment. And obviously it became even more pronounced as we got into the agricultural age. So these genes became more pronounced because they were more adapted to some level of carbohydrate, even though ancestrally it's not a good thing. We know from the deuterium point of view, to the oxidation point of view, to the glycation point of view, from all these angles, it's not a good thing. But these interglacial periods of small amounts created these adaptations, and why these people who basically tend to be an ApoE 4,4 have an over-exaggerated, levels of, when they go low carb, they have this over-exaggerated. It's because they're taking in those remnant chylomicrons and exporting them out as VLDL much more rapidly. This is part of what is actually happening. Also, when you go on a low carbohydrate diet, you will export out more VLDL, triglycerides, energy for the system. The difference is the only reason when they actually fast you and they actually take a blood sample, your trigs are much lower, is because you're using that energy. It's not just circulating, trying to find a place to deliver it until it actually is forced in a different state to be put away. It's basically trying to, the reason why on a carbohydrate diet and your triglycerides go up is because you've got excess sugar and the body has to convert that excess into fat and get rid of it. And so there is a bigger amount, and because the system is already getting a lot of sugar, it's got a lot of energy in the actual cells, you've got more circulating in the system. That's why it goes up. But in a low carbohydrate state, those triglycerides shrink very quickly to IDLs and then LDLs. And because you've got more, you're trafficking more on a low carbohydrate diet, you're pushing out more fat as energy, but you're actually taking it up very rapidly. So what you have is a lot of VLDL shrinking, and you end up with far more boats, LDL boats floating around, which tend to have more cholesterol in them, because a VLDL, when it gets exported, it doesn't just have, one thing. It has a lot of things. It has micronutrients in there, like the fat soluble vitamins. It'll have basically, the triglycerides. It'll have basically, other things in there to get to the body, and also you'll export also more, LDL as well, to get more of that extra fat out of the system. So our bodies are designed to, when they switch to fat oxidation, to basically export more fat into the system. So you will end up with smaller, as you offload these VLDL, these lipoproteins will shrink. So basically, they started as VLDLs, but they're actually shrunk down to LDLs, and you've got more in the system. That's the only thing. Now, people that are actually taking up, that means the initial fat that comes in as a chylomicron and then remnant, we don't measure that. And as a consequence, you get more. That is more, so it depends on how quick is that getting into the liver. That has to do with the ApoE. So somebody with an ApoE of 2.2 will have a much slower uptake into the liver, which means if you eat a lot of fat, you're not going to uptake it as rapidly, which means less boats are going to be out. As a consequence, because you've got more circulating chylomicrons that are basically being utilized, you need less boats to be exported out. That's why people on an ApoE of 2.2 tend to have less LDL. 3.3, like myself, usually have in the middle range, what is called, not too high, not too low type things. And if I consume a bit more in terms of food intake, it actually goes down. Mine goes down to 3.2 millimoles sometimes, 3.7 was my last one. So what I'm trying to say is that ApoE does have a role, but it's the trafficking of these boats that are the lipoproteins that are moving the stuff around. That is genetically determined. People need to get away from this. LDL traffic, having more, even cholesterol hypercholesterolemia, as it's called, familial hypercholesterolemia, as it's called, this so-called disease or whatever. There are many people that basically live long lives that don't basically have any problems whatsoever. At the end of the day, it's how severe you've got this sort of condition. If you've got a very severe, and there's a number of other pathways that are not compensating, you can die in childhood because of lack of nutrients coming through, because you're trafficking all this stuff, but you can't use it. So yes, it goes up. So what? As long as it's not oxidized, it's not damaged and all that, it's not causing any inflammation. But you're starving, your cells are starving for these nutrients, are starving for the stuff that's required to repair the system and all that. And that's where, Bart's right about that, that's what's happening in that sort of circumstance. Now, let me just show you some stuff, and we'll get into this to cover some of these points. That's the video that Bart just made. I've got him in a sleepy mode. And so this is the normal sort of bullshit low density lipoprotein sort of associational claptrap that these people talk about in terms of, this sort of condition. It's nonsense, in that regard. And Bart called it out really well and all that. And I actually, because he went away and chatted to his little academic, I think it's a lot of waste of
time. There we go, Mendelian randomization. It's just nonsense.
And Mendelian randomization is also nonsense. I got this sort of bullshit told. Remember, I was telling you about my cardiologist who had a go at me about this sort of bullshit. And I said, yeah, and what? just because certain people with a certain profile, if they're on a standard diet, have, certain, it's a Randall cycle, and people that have basically an ApoE of 4.4, they will be, the pronouncement, the effect will be more severe. It doesn't prove anything. It doesn't mean that LDL's a problem. It basically is that you've got, an LD, an ApoE phenotype that actually makes you more susceptible to inflammatory effects when you're on these sort of mixed diets, compared to somebody who's on an ApoE of 2.2, as an example. That's what this sort of bullshit misses in that regard. That's where the differences are. And, obviously when you've got an ApoE 2.2, you will traffic less LDL in the system. And that's where the association, but it is ignoring the Randall cycle activation, that these people are more vulnerable to these genetics. That's the real story behind that. And I love this one that Bart actually puts up, because, that's the total cholesterol level and all-cause mortality data and all that. And it's spot on. For normal people that don't have this, the familial hypercholesterolemia, this is what the data out there shows in terms of association. It's the low cholesterol that's actually the problem. And, there's plenty of research to show that. There's plenty of research out there. I mean, the LA veteran study actually showed that when you actually push cholesterol very low, after 7 years, you start seeing an increase in cancer. That's why they stopped the study, because they didn't want to show that. They should have continued right through to the decade as it was to happen. And over that decade, I suspect you would have seen an increase in cancer. There's a lot of statin use out there, and there is strong association with increases in cancer. I'm not saying there's a cause and effect proven, but some of these studies that were actually done, randomized control studies that were done for longer periods, like the LA veteran study, started showing that when you suppress cholesterol. Cholesterol is an important building block for the cells, and very important to basically maintain good, healthy cells. And if you're not repairing them because you don't have enough, and you're creating more senescence makes cells vulnerable to go to the next stage, which is cancerous. So that's well noted in the literature. And there's quite a lot of literature actually showing very low levels of cholesterol and states of what we call precancerous states emerging. So there's literature out there. Now, obviously, there's a lot of junk science showing strong association between cholesterol, high cholesterol, and cancer, but that's in a metastatic state. That's when these are rapidly growing and cell dividing, and all cells will take up and demand more resources. That's all the cancer cell is doing, is just saying, I need more cholesterol to build more cancer cells. So yeah, it's not the cholesterol that's a problem. It's basically that the cancer cells are just asking for more and grabbing more. And if they can't get it, they actually invade other cells and grab even more. So that's a metastatic state. That's already somebody getting to that. The question is, why did that person get to that? They didn't get an ancestral diet to that. They got on Randall cycle activated mixed macro bullshit diet with a lot of seed oils and crap that basically derange and damage their body over time. That's, at that stage, just because a cancer cell will use anything, will use lactate, will use ketones, will use everything, unless it's brain cancers, which can't use ketones very well and other things. But, many of the other cancers will use all resources like any other normal cell. The question is, how do you turn them off? And I've done a video on that, explaining some of the intricacies of actually shutting down certain pathways and also trying to turn cancerous cells back to senescent cells and then knock them off with fisetin. But that's another story in itself. That's not the focus of this video. But now, when we look at basically high frequency of our ApoE 4 alleles, so this in Kanoe-san, which is similar to the Bushmen of the Kalahari. This is a group of the sand people called Khoi, and they are in South Africa. So they're relatives of the Kalahari guys, and girls, but they part of that similar group. So variations in lipoprotein E gene location affects cholesterol concentration, the risk of atherosclerosis and Alzheimer's disease. That's associational stuff. Obviously, as I've said before, I'll be putting up at the end of this video, I'll be actually putting up the video that I did with Pim, my chat, which covers this, the reasons why these people are more susceptible, and it explains this, and associated with longevity in Caucasians. Because basically an ApoE of 4/4 may make you more vulnerable in terms of Randle cycle inflammation if you're not on a species appropriate diet. But if you are on a species appropriate diet, you will see more longevity because it also has more protection against pathogens, viruses, and other things. So it's actually, that's why it was the ancestral one. But when we veered away in those interglacial periods, started eating other things, we started making these shifts in terms of our ApoE, and then that sort of changed things over time as and it became more pronounced over many of the last quite a few thousand years that we've veered away from an ancestral diet, which is a sort of way for the body to adapt in a very toxic food environment that we created for ourselves since agriculture. So the body had to do something to slow down the uptake of remnant chylomicron to try and mitigate some of these damaging effects of mixed macros in high amounts. So, obviously the body hasn't been able to adapt to today's, because what we've done in the last 100 odd years is we've, just put that whole system on steroids, because we've got refrigeration now, we've got all these modern things, and we can actually just give you 24/7 sugar, where before it was only seasonal. Now it's 24/7. So the body just can't evolve that fast. So to literally keep out the fat from entering, because there's so much bloody sugar in the liver and in the cells. So it was a protective mechanism, this adaptation. We have determined ApoE gene frequency and effects on the cholesterol level in Khoi sand Bushmen. These are a group from South Africa, the sand people. The frequency of the ApoE allele is 0.37, which confers dose-dependent susceptibility to atherosclerosis and AED and Alzheimer's disease in Caucasians. That's because they're on mixed macro diets, and not ancestral ones, was twice as high. And ApoE for homozygote were 3 to 5 fold more frequent in the Khoi sand people, around about 10% compared with Caucasians, 2 or 3%. No significant effect of ApoE variations on cholesterol concentrations was noted in the non-Westernized populations with low plasma cholesterol, meaning 149. This suggests that the Bushmen carry a genetic burden, they call it. I just call it an ancestral allele phenotype for the later onset disorder, if exposed. That only happens if they're exposed to a Western lifestyle. Basically, think to a mixed macro diet, a non-ancestral mixed macro diet. That's what they basically mean. They just don't use the right language like we do. So that's really what it is in that regard. Now, in science, I only need to show one example to nullify the view that familial hypercholesterolemia is a problem. Let's take a look. Here's a 72-year-old patient with long-standing, untreated, yes, untreated, familial hypercholesterolemia, but with no coronary arterial calcification, CAC. a case report. So this report was published in April the 9th, 2018. And this old person was 72 years of age, but had basically 0 CAC score. So basically had genetic disease associated with persistent elevated levels of low density lipoprotein cholesterol, which ultimately leads to a greater increase in rates of atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease. That's only if you're engaging the Randall cycle. If you're not, it doesn't. Atherosclerosis progression can be clinically approximated through measurements of coronary artery calcification, CAC. CAC can be measured via electron beam computer tomography, multi-slice computer tomography, or contrast-enhanced CT. We presented the case of the 72-year-old man known as FH and established, because that's what they call familial hypercholesterolemia, FH. Yes, established hypercholesterolemia was consistently tested negative for any significant CAC. Actually, when they talk about negative, let's look at the sort of levels that we talk about negative. Obviously, this person in the past did about some nice and a few other things as well in that regard. But sort of in the end, for the last, since 2006, I believe, has been on a low carb diet. So has had even higher elevated levels of cholesterol in that regard. As you can see, total cholesterol, 2009, 542, 2013, 617. I think it was one of the person's highest. Their LDL is running at 450, 484, 506, just way, way up there. We've got pretty high levels of HDL, which is good. Trigs are a varied amount, which I don't have a problem with, and very low ApoE, LP(a), which is a protective mechanism. So obviously this person was not suffering. They've been on a low carbohydrate diet, I believe, since 2006. Yep. And they actually did the actual test. So pretty much 0-0. The scores nearly absent of any issue. That was in February 2018. So basically, the patient's score in terms of CAC was less than 1, which basically we can say 0 or very close to 0. It's less than 1. So that's what the CAC score was. So it isn't just because you've got, we have identified a man with a long-standing history of elevated lipid levels caused by a damaging variant. No, it's not a damaging variant. It's just, in the low density lipoprotein receptor gene. Despite his condition, our patient has surprisingly complete absence of significant coronary artery calcification, CAC. I wouldn't say the absence of significant, I would say 0. That's what your own data showed. Less than 1. I think less than 1 is 0 in the last time I did my maths. I like how they use this sort of language because, we're shocked. We don't know why this person has, such ultra high cholesterol and still the bugger has 0 CAC. And here we've got all these people on kibble and they've got very high CAC. What the hell is happening? What is it? It must be magical. Yes. Further efforts are underway to interrogate why our patient interrogate, sounds ominous, to interrogate our patients has escaped the damaging consequences of familial hypercholesterolemia of FH and could inform future efforts. Oh, what else? Drug discovery and therapy development. That's all they think about. What is it? Is it something in their blood? Is it something magical? Is there a unicorn in there that we can tap into and make shitloads of money? That's all they're concerned about. You know, basically, this guy is a bizarre case in their sort of view. This guy in the past did some medication as well, but the guy literally is has been following it up pretty much an untreated FH. And while the guys tried other things like, some of these drugs in the past, they're nice, and this was back in the 80s and stuff like that, pretty much, even was treated for a shorter bit of time with statins. It basically, as I say, progressively increased the dose intensity, commercially available, switched to maximum dose combination. They basically, therapy largely ineffective. Basically, they saw the statins were completely ineffective because this guy just has hardwired genetics for it. So the statins did absolutely nothing. And so this is the reason why this guy gave up on all this sort of stuff, because he tried a few medications in the earlier days, but it did absolutely nothing in that regard. And then eventually, sort of went away like the rest of us, looked at everything and said, I'm going to try something different. Subject reports since 2006 has eaten a high-fat, low-carbohydrate-based diet. So remember, he had the scan done in 2018. So 2018 minus 2006. So for 12 years, was doing a low carbohydrate diet, a high fat, low carbohydrate diet, and ends up with a CAC score of 0, near 0, they say, but 0 basically, practically okay. And this is guy's got FH, but he's not on a kibble diet. And before was doing some nice and a few other things, which you would get, like if you were eating pork, you'd get niacin. If you're eating tuna, you'd get good levels of niacin as well. Good animal foods that have got good nutrients. But even that wasn't helping. So even though he took statins for a short period of time, took niacin for a short period of time, took one of the other drugs, his FH was still high. They just couldn't get it down. So they used some interventions, still couldn't get it down. And pretty much they gave up. And then he just basically said, bugger that, I'm just going to try a low carbohydrate diet. And this is what he was generally ate a low fat, high carbohydrate diet before. He reported drinking an average, he never smoked. He drank, a couple of cups, 5 to 6 cups of coffee per day. And in the old days when he was on his high kibble diet, which was basically, again, probably because he was on a low fat diet, he wasn't engaging in the Randall cycle again. And that's what probably in the past he still had ultra high cholesterol, but not engaging in the Randall cycle, did have high levels of inflammation to create calcification. And then pretty much, but still had some issues with, sleep apnea, and things like, diverticulitis and things like that you will get on a kibble diet, all these things, the highly fibrous shit that goes into your gut. It is appendix 18, diverticulitis, a few things that he had issues with. Also reports that had, related to cancer as well. And this has been in his family as well. So he talks about this, but that's well known, that very low levels of cholesterol, like with the LA veteran study that I talked about earlier, does make you predisposed. It's a thing that that really sometimes kills a lot of people with FH is cancer. They tend to have much higher levels of cancer And it's due to the low cholesterol that they can't get into their cells. So this guy is actually doing a very high carbohydrate diet, trying to get a bit more of that stuff into the system through eating that sort of stuff. But basically, when it comes to cardiovascular risk or whatever, absolutely nothing. The biggest risk for these people is that they can't repair their tissue well enough, and it does predispose them to degenerative diseases, cancer included. If you can't get those nutrients in, you will basically get more senescence, more damage to your cells, and you won't be able to repair them. And that's a big problem. But in terms of the big issue that they talk about, calcification of the artery or anything else, high cholesterol is not. If it was, this guy should have a high CAC score, but doesn't. Most other people in young age, because 50% in weight of your cell membranes are made of cholesterol. If you're not getting it in and your body's starving of cholesterol, what do you think is going to happen? Your cells are going to break down, going to become more senescent. More senescence makes you more susceptible to cancer. That's what happens. And that's why these people tend to be very highly associated, people that have familial hypercholesterolemia with cancer. It's the unfortunate thing. It either will kill you in early age or in later age, potentially give you certain cancers. You can slow that down. His father had health issues. His mother died from cancer, so, and it actually does discuss that in here. These people are much more susceptible because of that. So it's not high cholesterol. High cholesterol will not give you clogged arteries, calcium in the arteries and all that. Doesn't happen, guys. Would have happened to this guy. Doesn't. It's engaging the Randall cycle that actually causes all these things, high inflammation because of mixed macro diets. This guy initially was doing a low-fat diet, so wasn't engaging the Randall cycle, then switched over to a high-fat diet to see whether that works. So he tried low-fat for many years, not engaging the Randall cycle, but getting deficiencies even more, then started having all these sleep apnea, all these problems, switched over to the other extreme in a sense. So avoided that middle ground, which is high amounts of sugar and carbs that probably would have killed him earlier and created a lot of Randall cycle, and that probably would have increased his calcification, stuff like that, engaging the Randall cycle and inflammation. But by switching from one, he switches to another, more species appropriate diet, and he's doing much better. He's doing way better. And these people, these cockwombles, are trying to work out why and whether they could actually spin off some money out of him through some therapeutics. Typical in that regard. But what this study actually shows you guys is, and this is important to get it through people's heads, what it shows is that what Bart's saying is correct. Bart's on the money. He understands that basically there is, these are just associations. I just have to show you one example to prove Bart right. I just showed you that example. This guy, 72-year-old, who's had FH all his life. He's not dead. Because he didn't engage the Randall cycle, he's not dead. Had he engaged the Randall cycle, he probably would have died much younger. And many young children that do engage the Randall cycle and have this condition usually do die much younger with their FH. And usually have a lot of these, have people with FH have a lot of high calcification. But is it the high cholesterol? No, it's the engagement of the Randall cycle. What Bart's been telling you guys, it's the engagement of the Randall cycle. This guy never engaged the Randall cycle. He was on a low fat, not engaging the Randall cycle. He shifted to a high fat, not engaging the Randall cycle, low carb, high fat. His levels are still up there. As you can see, his levels are still way, way sky high, but no CAC. So is it cholesterol? I just had to show you one case study to basically invalidate all the notions. Because if somebody, like in science, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, relativity, in terms of time dilation. I can do the experiment. You can do the experiment if you've got the equipment and the knowledge. Anybody can do the experiment. If you come up with the same result, that's empirical truth. It's replicatable truth. If you've got an outlier that basically does this to a hypothesis, because that's what this is doing. This guy, this 72-year-old is doing that to the hypothesis of FH, saying, it's not the high cholesterol, it's the engagement of the Randall cycle. Bart's right. So you can learn a lot from Bart. I've learned a lot, and I have a lot of respect for him. And he needs his support, guys. He left academia because he saw this shit. Pim and him had left the academia, and really it's social media, some of the other stuff, activities that he does. That's what feeds, provides, puts food on his table. I've got a day job. He doesn't. He's committed to basically exposing all this bullshit, doing the work to inform you guys to realize you've been had seriously, and why you need to basically approach life in a very different way. So he needs your support. Continue supporting him because he's a good bloke. His heart's in the right place. And, at the end of the day, he still needs to eat. So do give him your support when you have an opportunity and you can spare a few bob his way. Do the right thing in that regard. And I just wanted to do this video just as a support for Bart to basically nail, because he may not be familiar with this actual case study. I was going to do this next year, but because of today's video that Bart did, I said, nah, fuck it. I'm going to bring it forward to basically as a support for Bart and say, Bart's right about the Randall cycle. He's right about that FH is not a death sentence, and that these people talking about high cholesterol being an issue is just bullshit. If your LDL is native, it's not glycated, and it's not damaged by seed oils, rancid seed oils full of aldehydes and primary and secondary oxidative products damaging those lipid membranes. You know what? It's just going to float around, and it'll actually go in and out of cells and do its stuff and transport, nutrients around the body that the body needs, either in a very efficient way or a less efficient way in these people with FH. And that's why this guy doing a more ancestral diet is probably mitigating some of those issues. Yeah, maybe pushing those levels of LDL and all that super high, but you know what? Has mitigated a lot of those other health issues that on the low fat diet, which is less nutrient dense, was actually suffering. But shifting to a more ancestral one, those things have improved. And now they're scratching their head and going, does this person have some special genetics? The Mendelian sort of nonsense that these people think, is there something else in his genes that we can actually commercialize? Ridiculous, isn't it? But that's the sort of academia that we have nowadays. They're more focused on, rather than, searching for the truth, being truth seekers, or basically is what sort of drug can we spin off? That's the world we live in. Anyway, guys, on that side, I'm going to basically put the ApoE one that I did with Pim. So people should go and check that out. And the stuff that I've said in this video will make more sense. And I'll also put a link to Bart's one. So if people haven't seen Bart's, they know which one I'm referring to, the actual video. So anyway, see you guys. Hope you enjoyed it. And one other thing, just to remind you, in science, I just have to show one thing that actually is out of the normal to invalidate a hypothesis. And I've just blown that hypothesis sky high of FH with that single case study. Maybe somebody should be telling that to our dear friend, Dave. I'll leave you with that thought. Anyway, see yous.